Good morning again. This is our second in the series of our Sunday school, adult Sunday school class based on the international lesson. And we'll be looking at the second half of the first chapter of James. Just as a kind of introduction to explain a little bit what James is about, because James was a leader of the Jewish church in Jerusalem during that time, and the letter even begins, he addresses it to the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, there aren't 12 tribes of Israel at this time. There had been 12 tribes, and they had come into the land, had conquered it, had lived there. But about 700 years before the time of Jesus, the Assyrians came down from the land of what is now Syria and had conquered the 10 northern tribes. Many of them had been taken off into captivity. A few had been left in the land. But those who were taken off in captivity were never heard again. Those who were left in the land intermarried with people that the Assyrians brought into the land, and they became, for a large part, what we call Samaritans today. A group that still existed in the land of Israel, still hold to the Pentateuch, the laws of Moses that are found in the first 5 chapters. The 2 tribes that were left were Judah and Benjamin, and they comprised the kingdom of Judah, from which David came, and again, the family from which Jesus came, and from which our word Jew comes, from Judah. In any event, he writes to the general people of the Jewish nation, and so his letter contains much that carries the idea of Jewish understanding. Now, in the Old Testament, which is the Jewish scriptures, there are 2 main types of literature. What we call the law, which are the first 5 books, which the Samaritans still use today. And then the second part, which is called the prophets. In Matthew 22, there was an occasion in which a person came to Jesus and said, "Master, what's the greatest commandment of all?" And Jesus quoted to him Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God." And then he said the second is like unto it. And he quotes from Leviticus chapter 19, where he says, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." And then Jesus went on to say, "And on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Those 2 categories of Jewish literature in the Old Testament. Now there's a third, and that's called the wisdom literature. We find that in the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes, and in some other places in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 55 would be wisdom literature as well. Wisdom literature is not necessarily teaching deep theological things or commands or that, but it is giving practical, good advice, and sometimes very poetic. James is writing in particularly this second part of chapter 1 in what we call wisdom literature. For instance, he says, "Be slow to speak, but quick to listen. Slow to anger." That sounds a lot like what I find in Proverbs chapter 10. "When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but the prudent are restrained in speech." And in many other places, you find similar words of wisdom literature, advice on how to be a good person and to live in the way that God wants us to live. I think of Micah in the 6th chapter, where he says to love justice, to walk humbly with your God, to love mercy. Those are things to ponder about how to live in a proper way. So we have this wisdom literature that's there. I think of when I was a kid growing up, we had a small plaque on our wall made out of cardboard in Boston. It was very old. Other houses had them. My grandparents had them. But this one happened to say this: "Even a fish wouldn't get caught if he kept his mouth shut." That's kind of what wisdom literature is about. Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac contains a lot of good wisdom. Not necessarily deep theological thought, but good wisdom. And so this is what we would call wisdom literature. It's a good way to learn to live and to follow. So he says that we ought to listen more than we speak, and we ought to speak cautiously. And then he goes on to say, temper. is a real problem. Now, temper didn't stop being a problem in the first century. I know a man, I saw a man who has a problem with temper. And the thing that surprised me was that when I saw him, I was looking to a mirror. And that's when I saw him. So temper can be a problem today. And this wisdom literature of James is still appropriate for us today. Now, James goes on, as he talks about wisdom, saying it's important to listen. But we need to take it a step further. It's important to act. And he goes to say that if I hear that I need to love my neighbor, okay, I love my neighbor, and I go home, and I just go on with my life. And James says, wait a minute. How can you say you love your neighbor if your neighbor is cold, and you say, I heard that I need to love my neighbor? So it doesn't do your neighbor any good to be told that he's loved. If he's cold, he needs something to make him warm. Likewise, if he's hungry, just telling him to be filled is not enough. You need to provide it. And that's one of the things that Jesus did in his own ministry. His first miracle was at a wedding. He changed water to wine. On a mountaintop, he was teaching the people, and they were hungry, and the disciples came to him and said, you need to send them away. That's really what you need to do. And Jesus said, no, we need to feed them. And they said, we can't do it. And Jesus reminded them that we can sometimes do things that we don't know that we can do, and we need to try. And so he took 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he fed a multitude of people, reminding us that there's more in our hands than we realize, more things that we can do. Now, James goes on to say that when we hear the word and we don't act on it, it's kind of like looking in a mirror. We look in there, and we may notice our hair's not combed right, but we don't do anything about it. We may notice our collar is up on our shirt, but we don't do anything about it. He says, we go away from the mirror, and we forgot what we look like. He said that's kind of how it is in our faith. If it doesn't cause us to look at ourselves closely and to see where we need to make some changes. There's a prayer called the prayer of serenity. It says, Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom. There comes that word wisdom. The wisdom to know the difference. When I was in college, I saw an advertisement at a department store. The department store has long since been gone. It was called E.J. Corvettes back in those days in the 60s. But they had a special on getting your picture taken. And I went and I put on my suit, and I went to the store, and I paid to get my picture taken. And then I was to come back in a week for the proofs. Now, I don't know why they call them proofs. I don't know what it's supposed to be proving, but I'll tell you what, it didn't prove what it was supposed to be proving, because I came back in a week, and they had the black and white photo that they had taken of me, and they went to say, now we can touch this up with color. We can take the color of your suit, you tell us what color it was, and we'll touch it up. We'll touch up your hair. Of course, back then I had hair on my head, and we'll just make this thing look really good. And so I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So I authorized them to do that, put down the money that it would cost extra for this, and I came back in a week. They had it all fixed up. And in all honesty, I never looked so good. And that's the true statement. I never looked quite as good as they made me look. You see, they had touched it all up. I could look at that and I could say, my goodness, I'm a handsome fellow. And I don't even have Foster Grant sunglasses on. But that's kind of what James is talking about. We don't see ourselves as we really are. We miss something about seeing us. and so we let it go. In my parents' home, as a kid, my parents had a big tall dresser that they put their clothes in, and then they had a smaller one that had this flat level like this table is, and then a big mirror on the back. I mean a big mirror. And you know what they called that dresser? They called it a vanity. There's a reason for that. Because we want to see what we want to see. We don't want to see what we don't want to see. If you remember the story of Sleeping Beauty, the queen has a mirror and she looks into it and she says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" She doesn't like what the mirror tells her. We may not like what the mirror tells us. And James says we need to learn to listen to the mirror when it tells us we need to change, we need to be better. I took my young people when I was in Philadelphia, had a church there that I was a youth director at. I took them down to a religious group called Father Divine, the Church of Father Divine. He was a person that lived in South Philly. He and his wife, who was called Mother Divine, and they had this church group. We went down, had supper with them. They were very gracious, very kind. Now, Father Divine had passed away. He had died, which is kind of a shocking thing when God dies, that the church keeps on going. But their church kept on going, even though Father Divine was gone. Mother Divine was there, and there was a mirror sitting in front of the empty plate where Father Divine would sit. We asked, what was that mirror for? And she said, Father Divine would eat this meal, and to make sure he hadn't dribbled some food down, he would check in the mirror to make sure that he looked okay. In other words, if there was some food, he would take his napkin and wipe it to make sure it looked okay. I didn't understand why somebody who was God needed a mirror, but that was the case. Well, and be that as it may, that's kind of what James is talking about. We need to look at this mirror, look at ourselves, not to despise ourselves, but to see where we need to change and need to be a bit different. And sometimes we need to accept the things we can't change, to leave them in there. When Cromwell led the glorious revolution in England, and the king was deposed and he lost his head in that glorious revolution, the Puritans took over. They wanted to paint a portrait of him, and so they did. And they did kind of the same thing for him that they did for me. They painted it and made him look better than he really was. They showed him the portrait, and he said, "This is not acceptable. You need to paint me with the warts and all." See, he had some kind of ugly warts on his face. They had painted them out. And he said, "No, put them in. That's who I am. They need to see me as I am." Well, we need to see ourselves as we are, but realize that God is in the business of making us better. Making us better, not better than others, but better than we would be without God. That's a part of his dream. One man said it this way: God is easy to please, but hard to satisfy. In other words, he loves us as we are, but he won't leave us there. He wants to change us. And that's where James comes to kind of the conclusion of this second part of the first chapter, where he says, look, this is what real religion is all about. It's to visit the widows and the orphans in their need. Now, that's from the Old Testament, where God said that the tithe, the third-year tithe, was to go to take care of the widows and the orphans and the strangers or the aliens in your land, to care for them, to provide for their needs. As James words it, and also this was in the council of Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, where they said the Gentiles did not have to become Jews to become Christians. But he said this: please ask them to take care of the poor. Very important part of the life of the Jewish people and of the God that they were called to serve. So he says to visit the widows and orphans in their time of need, and then he added this final word, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. In other words, to keep yourself pure. That's a struggle, because like when we sit down to eat, it's so easy to spill some food on our clothing, or to have some that's on my beard, which my wife doesn't exactly fall in love with. But, you know, to do those things is a part of our faith. So reaching out to others and examining ourselves. It can be a small way to do it. You may give a call to somebody that is lonely. You may drop them a card. You may step by to visit. You may just have a prayer and they may never know that you prayed for them. But God knows it. So, love God. Do good. Don't do harm. All right? See you next week.